Natasha Denona released her new Retro Glam eyeshadow palette. Now, there were leaks of the photos of the palette like a week or so back, and now it's officially out so that you can purchase it at Sephora or Natasha Denona's website. Now, I am not planning to purchase that palette. One reason is because I'm not quite sure how some of the lighter shades will translate to my skin tone, and it just didn't give me, like, it didn't excite me enough to want to run out and pick it up. So I'm not going to get it. But I am curious about it, and so I decided to sort of see if I could dupe the vibes of that palette. Now, what I also know is that Sydney Grace came up with a bundle in memory of Mel Thompson, because she had created like a palette from their singles that she sort of deemed would be like a retro glam sort of palette. So I know some people are getting the Natasha Denona one. Some people are buying that bundle from Sydney Grace in memory of Mel. And I know that some of the proceeds will go to her family, which is awesome. So you do have some options. And another option is to check out what you have and see if you can dupe the vibes or the color story from that palette. That is the option I took, actually with a combination of purchasing some of the Sydney Grace shadows. The ones in the bundle that Mel had kind of come up with, I had some of them already, and I did get a couple of other ones, but I don't have some of them also. Now, what I did basically yesterday, I was having a terrible day, and for some reason, taking out my single shadows and like putting palettes together really, like, it just distracts me and it also just kind of calms me and separates me from the stress. So that is what I did for a significant portion of the day yesterday, and I think I came up with my own palette from Singles that kind of dupes the vibe of the Natasha Denona palette, but a little bit more suited towards a deeper skin tone. Here is the palette that I created. Now I'm going to go through and tell you about the shades and where they're from. Now these are all single shadows from, I think, just 3 brands, primarily from Sydney Grace. I have a ton of their singles, and I'm sure I could probably recreate this with some other singles that aren't in the circular pans. I do have some singles that are square, especially my Lethal Cosmetics ones, but I wanted things to be uniform, so here is what I came up with. I'm going to go ahead and show you some swatches, and then I'll also insert me creating this look here, and you can let me know, what are you planning to do? Are you getting the Sydney Grace bundle? Are you getting the Natasha Denona palette? Are you going to create your own? Tell me what you're thinking. While you kind of figure that out, let's go ahead and get into the swatches, and let me tell you about these shades. So the first thing I did was to read a description of the palette and the shades within the palette. Right off the bat, I noticed a lot of greens, a lot of browns, and a lot of pinks. That is pretty much this palette. Dusty pinks, champagne-y kind of pinks, sage green, ivy green, muted browns, cool browns, green, brown, pink. Those seem to be the colors that this palette has. So I then pulled out all of my shadows to kind of see if I could figure out ones that matched the descriptions of the shades, and I try to basically put them in the same kind of order and hopefully the same kind of vibe. So I'm not trying to get a spot on perfect dupe, but I'm trying to come close. All right, so why don't you come closer and let's do these swatches. Okay, so I have my palette that I've created, and I'll go ahead with the swatches. Now, starting from this shade, I'm going to just go across, start here, go across, start here, go across. Hopefully I can fit all of them on my arm so that you can see everything at once. Now, in the first shade that Natasha Denona has, it's called Flare, and it's described as a sparkling metallic vintage rose with a silver shift. To give me that similar vibe, I went with the Cleona Midnight Sun palette. I meant Midnight Sun shade. So here is that shade. I think it is sort of vintage rose, and it does have a bit of a silver shift. It's just a really pretty shimmer. The next shade in the palette is Jazzy, and it's described as a metallic dark cool brown. This one was kind of hard for me to figure out, but I decided to just go with the Sydney Grace shadow in Dream Big. So this shade is sort of a cool toned mauve-y brown. I feel like it does have a metallic sheen to it. Like, it's definitely not just a flat matte. And I thought that those two would look really great together for a really deep kind of plummy look. Now, the next shade in the palette is called Oscar, and she describes it as a metallic light medium vintage champagne. So I went for Sydney Grace Aim High. That was one swipe. Look at how beautiful that is. I think this is sort of like a champagne-y pink. It's got some silver in it, which seems to be kind of part of the color palette. Lots of like silver tones or metallic kind of formulas. I really like it. It's really bright and vibrant, and it's just kind of like a shocking color, especially against a deeper skin tone. So I feel like this is what I wanted to put in for like a vintage champagne, and it has kind of like a pink shift to it. Now, the next shade in Natasha's palette is called Evergreen. It's a matte cream to powder that's a medium dark sage green. I went back and forth on this one. I had some deeper greens and some lighter greens, but I settled on Sydney Grace Siren Call. Oh, there goes a concealer. So this shade is like a sort of between sage and ivy green, I would say. And I think it has a bit more of like a bluish kind of undertone, but I like it. And it just felt like it went really well. And in terms of the formula, it's a matte shadow, but it does feel very creamy. Not as like cream to powder as Natasha Denona's general like cream to powder shades, but I do find that it's a creamy, smooth matte that you can definitely build up. Now, the next shade in the Retro Glam palette is called Marlin, and it is described as a metallic light medium sage green. So for that, I went with Sydney Grace Mint Chocolate Chip. So this has a lot of shimmer to it, and I think it's just a really, really pretty color. Which reminds me of like shiny mint chocolate chip ice cream. And who doesn't want that on their eye or their stomach? In their stomach, I guess would be the correct thing. So I feel like these two go really well together. And then also you could pair the shimmers, the pinky champagne and this green, and really create a cool retro vibe kind of look. Now, the next shade, starting at the second row in the Natasha Denona palette, is called Maxi, and it is a metallic medium dark warm taupe. So I chose Sydney Grace Rover. This to me just looks like a metallic taupe. So that's why I chose it. It has that like taupey brown color to it, and then you've got the shimmer, which gives it sort of a metallic look, and I thought that was like the closest thing I could find. Now the next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Sage, and it is a matte medium sage green. I actually went a little different, and rather than a matte, I took this Cleona Vortex shade. So I went for more of a metallic, since there are just lots of metallics, or it seems like, in this palette, definitely having that sort of sheeny look rather than a flat matte look. And I just thought this was pretty and I like it. And yeah, so this is Cleona Vortex. Now, the next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Holly. And it is a matte light neutral rose. So for that, I went with Sydney Grace, and this is actually from one of their palettes, and this shade is called Lolly. What I did was I just potted all of the smaller Sydney Grace palettes I had. I think I had like 2 or 3. I didn't depot my Enduring Love, but I wanted to just take them out and have them as single shadows. So this is from one of their palettes. I'm blanking on the name, excuse me, but I can get that to you if you like. And this is the shade Lolly. For me, it's just like a neutral rose toned pink. The next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Fringe, and it is a matte pastel sage green. So for that, I went with Sydney Grace Honeydew. And I want to say that this really closely matches the description Natasha Denona has for her shade. To me, it does look like a matte kind of pastel sage green. Maybe a little lighter than a sage green, but you know, it works. And the last shade in that row that Natasha has is called Faye. It's a matte medium muted clay. And for that, I went with Sydney Grace Vanguard. This has such a smooth formula. So this is a bit deeper probably than their muted clay, but I felt like this would look a little better on my skin tone. It's sort of like a brown with some green undertones to it, and it will be a great shade to kind of deepen things up. Now let's go to the very last row. The first shade in that last row for Natasha Denona is Flutter, and it's described as a sparkling light champagne pink. I decided to go with Cleona Lacy. Look at that. That to me is like another sparkling champagne-y pink. You could probably even switch these out or kind of flip them, but that's the other like champagne-y one in the palette. The next one in Natasha Denona's palette is Lucy, which is a matte light limestone. I decided to go with Sydney Grace Bravo. There you go. That is just a nice matte green. It doesn't feel like it's a completely flat matte. It does feel like there's a little tiny bit of like a shine to it, but mainly just a matte. Now, the next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is Palladian, and it is described as a metallic pastel sage green. So I decided to go with Sydney Grace Green Mango. And I would say that's pretty dead on for a metallic pastel green. The next shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Belle, and it's a matte medium dusty rose. For that, I went with Sydney Grace Sweet Tooth, and this is again from one of their small, like 9-pan shadows. And there, that one is. I think that fits pretty well for a dusty rose. I would say mine is a bit deeper than medium. It's like a deep dusty rose. And the last shade in the Natasha Denona palette is called Oz. Did I say that the one before was Belle? Hopefully. The last shade in her palette is called Oz, and it's described as a metallic medium dark muted forest green. Now this is the one that I had the hardest time with. I kept switching shades in and out, but I decided that I wanted to go with Pretties for Your Face shade Fuse. Now this is a green, like duochrome shade, and I really think it is sort of like a forest green. It's not as muted, I believe, as Natasha Denona's, but this to me seems like a metallic, dark forest green. So let me move that out of the way. Move Rosé out of the way. So here is my palette. First we've got Cleona Midnight Sun. Then we've got Sydney Grace Dream Big. We've got Sydney Grace Aim High. Sydney Grace Siren Call. Sydney Grace Mint Chocolate Chip. Our second row is Sydney Grace Rover. Cleona Vortex. Sydney Grace Lolly. Sydney Grace Honeydew, Sydney Grace Vanguard. And our last row, we've got Cleona Lacey, Sydney Grace Bravo, Sydney Grace Green Mango, Sydney Grace Sweet Tooth, and Pretties for Your Face Fuse. And then here is the palette in its little magnetic palette. This is a magnetic palette from Sydney Grace. It's their large one, but here are all of the shades together in my version of a retro glam based on Natasha Denona's own retro glam palette. So now that we have the swatches, I'm gonna go ahead and show you me doing this look, which is basically just using some of the shades from the palette. So that is it, and it is time for me to go wash this off before my next client. I'm just getting those videos in between clients, right? I should be writing notes. Anyway, I like this palette. I like the vibe that I duped. Now, I am pretty glad that I stuck to trying to dupe it rather than purchasing it, because I don't know that I typically would put together greens, pinks, and browns. And especially more on this lighter kind of pastel-y sort of vibe, but I really like what I created. I really like the palette that I came up with, and I kind of like it better than the retro glam that was released, mainly because I think I was able to choose shades that I know would show up on my skin tone, and I'm just not convinced about the retro glam palette. Let me know if you have any of these Sydney Grace, Cleona, or Pretties for Your Face shades, or if you have anything similar. Let me know if you've tried to dupe it. I also feel like I could probably cut this palette down to maybe, so it's like 15 shades. I think we could do a 9 shade like palette. I really do think we could. Maybe even getting it down to a quad with one of the pinks, the greens, the browns, and like another like multi-chrome or something. That would be kind of fun too. Okay, I think that is it. I'm hoping that some of this was helpful for you. It was really fun for me. I needed something to just like distract me, and so I don't know how it has happened, but sitting down and playing with single shadows has become a way for me to relax. I'm gonna go process that with my therapist in a couple of hours. I really hope that you're continuing to take care of yourself. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.